My day job used to be at the University of Houston. So I was a faculty member there for about 12 years in the Department of Educational Psychology, and my research area is kids with behavioral problems. So we work with a lot of the larger school districts around the country around behavior, improving behavior for students. One of the things that I often will say is that we have a pretty good idea of what works for kids with behavioral problems. You know, our biggest challenge is getting what works implemented consistently in the schools. So really the biggest challenge around behavior that we see is helping to improve implementation processes. And one of the first districts that we worked with was in our backyard, which was Houston ISD. So Houston ISD was the first district we worked with when I was at the university. And we worked with their students with severe emotional and behavioral disabilities. And the second district we started working with was Dallas ISD. And that's where Andre and I met.
My name is Andre Banks again, and I am the Director of Implementation for the company. I've been here probably about 4.5 to 5 years. But prior to that, as Stewart said, I worked in Dallas ISD as an ED teacher, and my certification says that Andre Banks Certified Emotionally Disturbed for life. So,
and it's true.
Yeah, and I'll bring that for you. So I started out there, then I left there, became a behavior specialist for a few years. In the last 9 or 10 years in the district, I worked as the program coordinator for the EBD program. All right.
And Andre in his district was the second to implement, and we implemented with them around a lot of different issues. Actually, one of the things that we did when we got started was Andre and I actually did a lot of research together. We spent probably a couple of years researching the software, the outcomes we were getting with the process. And then we spent 2 years really kind of researching the implementation process. You know, one of the things I'll say a lot of times is that educators are very eager to take on initiatives that improve outcomes for kids. But sometimes you have multiple initiatives competing for time, and it's tough to get those initiatives going and sustained. So we spent a couple of years really trying to figure out how could we partner with the districts to help sustain the implementations. So we spent a couple of years doing that as well. So we really talk about 3 reasons as to why addressing behavior is important from our perspective. And these are really research-based findings that you see in the literature pretty consistently. And one is that we know problem behavior disrupts the school climate, right? The research is pretty clear. High-performing schools have fewer behavioral incidents than lower-performing schools. We also know that problem behaviors and academic performance are interrelated. So we know that students who exhibit the early onset of behavioral problems are 3 times more likely to fail, drop out, have other types of issues than other students. And the last point that I like to make is that disruptive behavior is almost always identified in exit surveys as one of the primary reasons why teachers leave the teaching profession. When you look at the research, there really are those 6 categories that tend to show up consistently around the types of behavioral problems teachers struggle with, and they represent across the areas that we were just discussing. One of the things that we like to do in our system is teachers go through this process of identifying what the problem behavior is, and then we help them identify what the pro-social behavior is. We're trying to teach them and give them strategies and ideas of what they can do for them. But we also collect a lot of data about what types of behaviors teachers struggle with most often. The interesting thing about this is that teachers are working on all these behaviors, and they all frequently occur. One of the things that we find, and this was data on about 3,300 kids, right? So it's a lot of data on a lot of kids, and this is kind of consistent across the years. Now, the defiant is the one that we see most consistently identified. Aggression was the one that we see least often identified, which was actually kind of surprising to me. I thought aggression might be a little higher. But these are students in the ED group. And so a lot of times I think what happens is that, so these are like from behaviors from a behavioral intervention plan, right? So if a kid's aggressive, there's a code of conduct that tends to go into place, right? And they get sent to a different place. What we wanted to do next was then look at which types of specific behaviors from these different categories were teachers working on. And this is actually where the academics showed up. So the number 1 was argues with adults. 25% of the plans of the 3,300 had argues with adults in it. Doesn't comply with rules, has emotional outbursts, doesn't complete assignments, and doesn't complete assignments accurately. So those were the 5 behaviors that the teachers talk about a lot that were identified on the behavioral intervention plans. And this is important because these are the behaviors that are driving the referrals into special ed, right? So do these results make sense to you guys? Pretty consistent with what you see? We see these similar pattern kind of regardless of the geographic makeup of the district. So if it's a large district or a small district, if it's a rural district or an urban district, we see this pattern show up in the plans. And as I said, we've been looking at this data for about 5 years. And some of the behaviors at the bottom may kind of switch in and out a little bit, but not often. It's been a pretty consistent pattern. If you go back and you look at research from the 70s, if you guys remember the research they talked about, the behaviors that teachers struggle with.
Most of these people weren't born in the 70s.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Thanks for clarifying that, Andre. So, well, that's what they found as well, is that these were the types of behaviors that teachers were struggling with. Now, Andre was just chomping at the bit to join in, so I'm gonna hand this over to him, and Andre's going to talk a little bit about some of the experiences he had with implementing systems in districts and his goals and initiatives.
Okay, Stewart kind of touched upon why systems doesn't work in schools. We know that school districts often have multiple initiatives, right? We're doing a lot of things at the beginning of the year. We want teachers to take this kind of data, do these kinds of activities. So that's one of the things that impact that. We know that school systems don't design or address behavior as often as they do academics. It's kind of the second or the stepchild in the school systems. We know that frequency and severity of behavior problems can be overwhelming. You can have several kids in your school that are kind of taking over the school. And it can be one kid that can overwhelm the whole school. And there are schools that have that one kid there that everybody's dealing with, and it's kind of messing up the whole climate of the school.
Can I ask you a quick question while you do this? How many of you guys have started getting calls around bullying and cyberbullying, right? Because that's what happens, right? Something in the press pops up, it gets a lot of attention, there's some crisis that occurs, and all of the resources and focus shifts to that problem, the intense problem, and I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
And sometimes that takes away from the efforts of trying to do prevention and sustain the lower level behaviors that tend to percolate up and result in the more severe issues.
Sure. And we also know that there's a public demand for safety in schools, So those are some of the things we kind of pulled from the research that looked at why behavioral systems are overlooked. And like you said, a lot of people don't get a lot of training on that, particularly teachers. And administrators in their training, there's not a lot of training on behavior management system. There's more things on discipline and how to follow the code of conduct. So these are some of the reasons why behavioral systems don't get implemented. Again, there's a high emphasis on academics. We're in a high-stake testing area, and everything's centered around the state assessment. That's one big impact to behavioral system. We don't focus on that because it's not the most important thing that we're evaluated on. It's one of those indicators, but not the most important in our minds. We know that there's a disconnect between academic and behavior. There's some who believe that if we have a well-run, well-behaved classroom, then academic will flourish. There are others who believe that if I have a strong academic curriculum, that behavior will subside. But the reality is they're both important. We know that effective teachers have a well-defined lesson that meets all the diversity of their learners. We also know that effective teachers have a well-run classroom. They have good behavior management as well as classroom management. So both are important for making student academic progress.